Leah stared at the crumpled piece of paper in her hand. The address, 275B Warren Avenue, was scrawled in jagged handwriting, a smudge of ink bleeding through the cheap paper. She checked her phone again, scrolling through the listing she'd found late last night in a desperation-fueled haze. The rent was suspiciously low, especially for a place so close to campus, but beggars couldn't be choosers. After weeks of couch surfing and sleeping in her car, Leah didn't have the luxury of turning down a bargain. Her rideshare pulled up to the curb of a looming gray brick building that looked like it had been forgotten by time. The windows were dusty, most of them framed by peeling paint. A flickering 275 sign buzzed faintly above the door, but there was no sign of a B. The driver hesitated, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "You sure this is it?" he asked. Leah nodded, masking her unease with a tight smile. "Yep, thanks." As the car pulled away, she adjusted her backpack and scanned the building. The listing said to enter through the side alley. Leah's stomach churned as she stepped into the narrow passage, the shadows between the buildings swallowing her whole. At the end of the alley, a rusty metal door waited. She pushed it open, her hands trembling slightly. Inside, the stairwell was dimly lit, a single exposed bulb swaying from a cord. The faint scent of mildew lingered in the air. Leah's footsteps echoed as she climbed to the second floor. The hallway stretched out before her, impossibly long and lined with doors that looked as old and worn as the building itself. Her phone buzzed, a text from the landlord. "App 3B, the key is under the mat. Welcome home." Leah exhaled, forcing herself to focus on the good. It was cheap, it was close to campus, and it was hers. She found the door marked 3B at the very end of the hall. Sure enough, a tarnished brass key waited beneath a tattered welcome mat. The apartment itself was better than she'd expected. It was small but functional, with a kitchenette, a modest living area, and a bedroom tucked behind a folding door. The furniture was mismatched but clean, as though someone had pieced it together from thrift stores. A single window looked out onto the alley, its glass smudged and cloudy. As Leah unpacked, a peculiar feeling settled over her. The silence was too heavy, too absolute, as if the apartment were sealed off from the rest of the world. When she leaned out of the window, she could hear the city, cars honking, distant voices, but the sounds didn't penetrate the walls. It was like the apartment existed in a vacuum. That night, Leah lay in bed scrolling through her phone. The Wi-Fi password left by the landlord worked, but only barely. Pages loaded slowly, and videos refused to play. She made a mental note to check her data plan in the morning. At some point, she drifted off, her phone slipping from her hand. A sharp knock jolted her awake. Leah sat up, disoriented. The room was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the street lamp outside. She glanced at her phone, 3:17 a.m. Another knock, louder this time, echoed through the apartment. She crept to the door, her pulse pounding in her ears. Peering through the peephole, she froze. A woman stood on the other side, her face pale and expressionless, her dark hair hanging in limp strands. She wore a tattered coat and clutched something against her chest. Leah's stomach churned when she realized it was a small, misshapen doll. "Hello." Leah's voice wavered as she called through the door. "Can I help you?" The woman didn't respond. Instead, she raised her free hand and knocked again, 3 times, slow and deliberate. The sound reverberated through the wood like a heartbeat. Leah stepped back, her mind racing. She debated opening the door, but something about the woman's vacant expression sent a chill down her spine. Finally, she called out again, "I think you have the wrong apartment." The woman tilted her head, her eyes narrowing as though she were studying Leah through the door. Then, without a word, she turned and shuffled back down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows. Leah locked the deadbolt and leaned against the door, her heart pounding. It was probably just a confused neighbor, she told herself, nothing to worry about. But when she checked the peephole again, the hallway was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no other doors, no signs of life, just an endless stretch of dimly lit space. The next morning, Leah tried to shake off the unease. She spent the day unpacking and even managed to set up her desk for the semester. But as evening crept in, the oddness of the apartment became harder to ignore. The silence pressed against her ears, the air felt heavy, and the flickering hallway light outside her door cast unnerving shadows. Around 9 p.m., Leah decided to call the landlord. She'd never met him in person, just exchanged texts and emails, but his replies were always curt and to the point. When he answered, his voice was gruff, almost irritated. "Yeah. Hi, it's Leah. I just wanted to ask about the building." "You need something fixed?" he interrupted. "Well, no. It's just, strange things have been happening. Last night someone knocked on my door and—" "Don't open it," the landlord cut in sharply. "What?" "Don't open the door," he repeated, his tone low and final. Before Leah could respond, the line went dead. That night, the knocking started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Leah sat frozen on the couch, staring at the door. Through the peephole, she saw not one, but several people standing outside. They looked normal at first glance, neighbors maybe, but their eyes were wrong, glassy and unfocused, like marbles in waxy flesh. "Let us in," a man's voice rasped. His tone was low, almost pleading. "Please, it's so cold out here." Leah backed away, clutching her phone. She tried calling the landlord again, but her phone screen flickered and froze. The Wi-Fi cut out entirely, leaving her stranded in silence. "Let us in," another voice whispered. This time it was a child's. Leah pressed her back against the far wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She could feel the weight of their presence through the door, the knocking growing louder and more desperate. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It stretched on for what felt like hours, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards overhead. Leah didn't sleep that night. Leah's eyes opened, heavy with sleep. The pale morning light came through the window, gray and weak. She had fallen asleep on the couch, and her neck hurt from the awkward angle. Her mouth felt dry, like she hadn't had water in days. She stood up slowly, stretching her stiff arms. The apartment smelled strange. It wasn't strong, but it reminded her of old pennies or rusty pipes. Leah walked into the kitchen to grab something to eat. The small fridge buzzed loudly, almost like it was groaning. She opened the door and stopped. The eggs she had bought yesterday were cracked, not just one or two, all of them. Tiny lines spread across their shells like spider webs. Something inside them smelled sour, sharp, and wrong. Leah turned up her nose and quickly shut the door. She didn't feel like eating anymore. By the afternoon, Leah couldn't take being in the apartment. The air felt heavy, like she was trapped in a box. She grabbed her bag and went outside. The cool air hit her face, and it felt good. The noise of the city was a relief. Cars honked, people talked, and dogs barked in the distance. It was so much better than the quiet, strange apartment. At the campus library, Leah sat down with her laptop. She planned to work on her paper, but her mind was somewhere else. She typed the address of her apartment into a search bar. The building popped up on a map, but something wasn't right. The address only listed 2 apartments per floor, 3A and 3C. There was no mention of 3B anywhere. Leah frowned and searched again. Page after page said the same thing. 3B didn't exist. Her chest tightened. If her apartment didn't exist, then where was she living? When she came back to the building later, Leah stopped in the alley. She looked up at her window. It was dark, almost like no one lived there. The hallway inside was colder than usual, and the old carpet felt damp under her shoes. When she got to her door, her heart sank. The welcome mat was gone. In its place was a dirty strip of carpet, stained and frayed. Leah stared at it. Something about it made her skin crawl. She unlocked the door with shaky hands and stepped inside. The apartment felt wrong. The air was thick, and the shadows seemed darker than before. She set her bag down on the floor. Her eyes went to the window. There was a handprint on the glass. It was faint but clear, like someone had pressed their palm against it. Leah's stomach twisted. Slowly, she walked to the window and wiped at the glass with her sleeve. The handprint didn't go away, it just smeared, leaving gray streaks. Above her, a loud thud made her jump. Her head snapped up. Another thud followed, heavier this time, like something big had hit the floor. Leah froze. There was no fourth floor. She spent the rest of the evening pacing the apartment. Her nerves were frayed. She felt like the walls were closing in on her. She grabbed her phone and dialed the landlord's number. It rang and rang until a gruff voice answered. "Yeah. Hi, it's Leah. I live in 3B. I wanted to ask, is something broken?" he interrupted. "No, but strange things are happening. Last night someone knocked on my door and—" "Don't open it," he said quickly. "What?" Leah asked. "Don't. Open the door," he said again, slower this time. His voice was firm, almost angry. Then he hung up. The knocking started again that night. It was soft at first, almost polite. Leah sat on her bed, her phone clutched in her hand. Her stomach tightened as the sound grew louder. "Please," a man's voice said. It was low and calm. "Please let us in." She crept to the door and pressed her ear against it. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "Who are you?" she whispered. The knocking stopped, but the voice spoke again. "Let us in, we're cold." Leah stumbled back from the door. Her fingers shook as she texted the landlord. "Why are people knocking on my door? Who are they?" The reply came almost right away. "Don't talk to them. Don't let them in." Leah's hands trembled. She typed again. "What do they want?" This time, there was no answer. The knocking stopped suddenly. Leah sighed with relief, but then a scratching noise began. It came from the window. She turned slowly, her whole body stiff. Her eyes went to the glass, and her heart nearly stopped. The handprint was back. It was bigger now, pressed harder against the glass. Leah stepped closer and saw something else. Footprints. Bare, human footprints leading from the window to the couch. Her knees felt weak, and she sank to the floor. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The scratching at the window grew louder. It went on and on, long into the night. When the sun came up, Leah left the apartment without looking back. She couldn't stay there anymore. She walked to a coffee shop a few blocks away. The warmth and noise inside calmed her. She ordered a cup of tea and sat at a small table, staring into the steam. A barista came by to wipe the table next to her. He glanced at her face and frowned. "You okay?" he asked. Leah hesitated, then asked, "Do you know anything about 275 Warren Avenue?" The barista froze. His face turned pale. "No one's lived there for years," he said quietly. Leah blinked. "That's not true. I live there now." He shook his head. "That building burned down a long time ago. No one's lived there since." Leah ran. Her feet hit the pavement hard, the sound echoing in the empty alley. The cold air stung her lungs, and her vision blurred with tears. She didn't stop until she burst into the street, the city lights flickering like distant stars. When she finally looked back, the apartment building was gone. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The lot where the building should have been was empty, just cracked concrete and tall weeds swaying in the breeze. Leah's chest ached. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she'd seen. Had she imagined it all? The knocking, the voices, the burned faces. Her legs felt weak, but she couldn't stop moving. The weight of the night pressed down on her, heavy and unbearable. She wandered aimlessly, her hands trembling as she clutched her coat tighter around her. Eventually, she found herself in a park. The trees were bare, their branches clawing at the sky. A faint mist clung to the ground, curling around her ankles. The quiet was eerie, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. Leah stopped to catch her breath, her heart still pounding. That's when she saw it. Through the fog, rows of headstones appeared, their edges worn and crumbling with age. She blinked, her breath catching in her throat. A cemetery. Something pulled her forward, though she couldn't explain why. Her feet moved on their own, crunching softly over the frost-covered grass. The cold seemed to seep into her bones, but she didn't stop. As she walked deeper into the cemetery, a familiar feeling settled over her. It wasn't fear, it was something else. A strange heaviness, like she had been here before. Her steps slowed when she reached a cluster of graves at the far end of the lot. These headstones were darker, older, the names etched into them barely visible in the dim light. But one of them caught her eye. It stood alone, slightly tilted, the name on it barely legible. Leah crouched down, brushing her fingers over the rough stone. Her heart stopped when she saw her own name carved into the granite. Leah Richards, 1968 to 1993. No, she whispered, stumbling back. Her chest tightened as the world spun around her. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. But her name was there, plain as day. Below it was a short inscription. Lost in the fire, forever missed. Leah's knees hit the ground. Her mind reeled as fragmented memories flickered through her head, firelight dancing on the walls, smoke filling her lungs, and screams echoing in the distance. She clutched her chest, gasping as the realization hit her. She had died. The apartment fire, 30 years ago. Leah stared at the grave, tears streaming down her face. She shook her head, trying to push the truth away, but it was too late. More memories began to surface, piecing themselves together like a terrible puzzle. She had been there the night of the fire. She had been the reason it started. It was supposed to be a small flame, a candle to light her way through the dark hallway. She hadn't meant to knock it over. She hadn't meant to let the fire spread, but it had, and it had taken everything. 12 people had died because of her. Families, neighbors, people who had trusted her. No, Leah sobbed, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. But it didn't matter. The fire had consumed them all, and her body had never been found, lost in the rubble. She had been bound to the apartment ever since, wandering its empty halls, unaware of who she really was. Until now. The mist around her grew thicker, swirling like smoke. Leah looked up and saw figures emerging from the fog. It was them. The woman with the doll, the man with the hollow eyes, the child with the burned teddy bear. One by one they appeared, their faces solemn and sad. Leah's hands trembled as she stood. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The figures surrounded her, their gazes heavy with something she couldn't quite name. I'm sorry, Leah whispered, her voice cracked under the weight of her guilt. I didn't mean to. I didn't know. The child stepped forward, clutching the charred remains of the teddy bear. You locked us in, she said, her voice soft but clear. Leah's stomach dropped. She remembered now. She had locked the door to the stairwell, thinking it would stop the fire from spreading. She hadn't realized it would trap them inside. I'm sorry, Leah sobbed. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. The figures stared at her in silence, their expressions unreadable. Leah sank to her knees, her tears falling freely. Please, she begged, please forgive me. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the woman with the doll stepped forward. She knelt in front of Leah, her pale hand resting on Leah's shoulder. It's time, the woman said. Her voice was soft, almost kind. Leah looked up, her eyes red and swollen. Time for what? To let go, the woman said. The others nodded, their faces softening. One by one, they faded into the mist, their forms dissolving like smoke. Leah felt a warmth spread through her chest, light and peaceful. For the first time in 30 years, the weight on her soul began to lift. She closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath. When Leah opened her eyes, she was standing at the edge of the cemetery. The mist was gone, and the sun was rising over the horizon, casting a soft, golden glow over the graves. She looked down at her hands. The key to 3B was gone. For the first time, Leah felt truly free.